Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Presidential transitions are typically seen as kind of this like academic, not particularly interesting thing that we kind of take for granted. Coming out of the 2020 election, though, clearly presidential transitions are going to be at the center of the next few elections, especially given the fact that there is I'd say roughly 50-50 chance that Donald Trump could be returning for a second term, therefore creating another transition moment. The 2020 transition between the first Trump administration and the first Biden administration went particularly poorly, not just in the January 6th sense, but also in the actual compatibility between different parts of the government. Typically, outgoing administrations could work compatibly with their incoming successors. That didn't quite happen, though. My guest today, Heath Brown, is a professor. He has a new book coming out. It's called Roadblocked: Joe Biden's Rocky Transition to the Presidency. It gets into everything that went wrong during 2020 and how that can inform how a possible succession this year could go much, much better. We also discuss the role that outside groups and outside organizations like the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 agenda play in setting the tone for what happens in an administration and how those transitions actually affect the election beforehand in terms of arguing about the incoming agenda. So lots of great stuff here. Really helpful conversation. Hope you all enjoy it. Huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation for supporting the work of this podcast. Heath Brown, welcome to the Realignment.
Yeah, so great to be here. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat with you. I'm also excited to chat with someone who has listened to specific episodes of the show because you kind of are going to get my interview style, but also get some of the topics that the audience is interested in. So let's just start here. The book we're discussing today is Roadblocked: Joe Biden's Rocky Transition to the Presidency. This is a book about presidential transitions, a topic which I think, given the contested nature of the 2024 election, is incredibly relevant to what everyone should be thinking about right now. It would have been one thing to read this book in 2022, but in 2024 it obviously means something. Here is where I'd like to start. I'd love for you to give your articulation of where you think the Biden administration is politically, from like a political strength perspective, but also from a policy strength perspective, because those are not necessarily the same thing in a kind of depressing sense. And what do your answers to those policy and political questions have to do with this rocky transition? Is there a world where the administration was in a better place because there was a more effective transition? Is there a world where the political narrative was stronger because there was a better transition? You could take that broad question anywhere you want to go.
Yeah, I'd love to take that question on. And you know, if we think about what's going on right now, where we are in the country, you have to go back to the start. You have to go back to the transition. I guess that's the argument of the book. And I think where we are today is kind of where we started, which was a very effective Biden-Harris team at governing. This is a team that's put together based on years and years of experience. And I think they're very effective at running the government. Perhaps more so than many recent presidents. Whether they're politically effective at doing that is a whole other thing. And I think that's really what this campaign is about, is trying to judge both the sort of politics of Joe Biden, but also what has always been his greatest strength, which is his effectiveness of running the government. And so I think a lot of that goes back to the transition. This is a transition that happened in the most unusual of circumstances, during a pandemic, during national protests unseen, in generations, a transition that was done almost entirely from home, people working from their laptops, kind of the way we're talking today. And as a result of all of that, what they accomplished during that time period is in many ways miraculous. To be able to effectively transition this massive federal government during a transition at home with a less than cooperative outgoing administration. And to do that in the way that it did is pretty remarkable. Now, the politics of that is very different. And so part of what the book tries to do is wrestle with what has always been thought of as a very bureaucratic process, which is, making decisions that no one ever really pays attention to, but their political significance is quite massive. And so I think that's in many ways a good way to think about where we are today. And I think what a lot of voters are going to be trying to evaluate over the next 6 months from when we're recording on through November, which is to try to look at the Biden-Harris policy record, look at their record on governance, that is things like recovery from the pandemic, economic recovery being one of the most important, and compare that to their political record and the way in which they have navigated these very difficult political times. And I think voters, all voters, are going to be looking at that and looking at the things that will happen until the election. I think looking back to the very earliest is a very good way to start that for many voters.
Yeah, and I think I want to dial down on a definition from you, because I think some folks who are kind of half listening will hear you say the Biden administration is effective, and they're going to read that in purely kind of political policy terms, as in, I am Heath Brown, I'm broadly center left or left of center left or left, and I like the Inflation Reduction Act. I like the Chips and Science Act. I like these democratic policies. But when I hear you say effective, you're talking about the actual governing agenda. We are the Biden administration. We want to enact a set of policies. We have a set of officials we want to put into specific offices. We want to reduce leaks. I think if you're comparing that Biden a team to the Trump team, you see a administration that was, I think, politically ineffective in the sense that leaks, chaos, firing the transition director, Chris Christie, way too late in the game. So talk about how we should think about this effectiveness term when we compare the Trump transition in 2016, 2017 to the Biden transition in 2020, 2021 in a way that's actually policy neutral. This isn't about whether or not you want a wall built or whether you want immigration policy to change. This is an administration has to think, how do we actually set up a process by which we accomplish our actual objectives?
Yeah, that's, I think, a great way of thinking about this. And effectiveness is such a tricky term because it has these dual meanings. It has meanings for partisans, which is effectiveness of getting your agenda through. And then it has this other meaning, which has to do with the effectiveness of carrying out your agenda. And I think that gets to the difference between campaigning and the transition process. And the campaigning process, which most people pay attention to, has to do with slogans and agendas and messages and mottos. It has to do with the party, has to do with what the candidates believe in. The transition process in the US has always been something a little bit different. It's always been sort of stripped of partisanship, historically. Historically, it's been stripped of ideology. It's been thought of as a time period where partisanship is put to the side and cooperation for the interest of the country takes precedence. And we know this most clearly from 2008, when George W. Bush said to his White House, no games. We're leaving office. They've served 2 terms and no games. Whether a Republican or Democrat wins, we are going to be cooperative with that incoming administration. We're going to act like a team. We're going to share information because the safety and security of the country matters most. And George W. Bush knew this because on September 11th, what happened has been pinned, especially by the 9/11 Commission, to the difficulties of his transition period. And George W. Bush, when he was leaving office, said, not again. We're not going to do that again.
By the way, what do you mean by, so obviously, what specific like structural difficulties did 9/11 have to do with there?
Yeah, exactly. So the 9/11 Commission said that we have an appointment process specifically that is too slow, too cumbersome, and too many key officials aren't in place on day one. And in the transition to 2000, 2001, it took too long, according to the 9/11 Commission, for George W. Bush's full foreign policy intelligence team to be up and running. And one of the things that did was made their understanding of world problems not get up to speed as quickly as it should have. And they say one of the reasons why the intelligence community was slow to respond to the threats of 9/11 was that it didn't have its team in place early enough. Remember, September 11th happened within the first year of George W. Bush's time in office. And so this was sort of the extended transition period. The 9/11 Commission, not George W. Bush, the 9/11 Commission independently pointed to the transition period and the appointment process, that is the staffing of government, as a liability. George W. Bush said that's not going to happen again. And when Barack Obama won in 2008, he said to his White House, we're going to work together as a team. We're going to cooperate, even though his outgoing White House knew that Barack Obama's policy agenda was going to be very, very different from his agenda. And so he recognized that governance, in that case, mattered more than the policy and the ideology. And so when I refer to effectiveness, I think I'm really trying to get to that sense of effective governing. Whatever the ideology of the party in power is, whatever their policy agenda is, the effectiveness of effectuating it, of actually getting the government up in place, staffing it, executing it, making sure that the trains run on time. And that's in part because the transition process is a massive enterprise, dealing with issues that are hot button, dealt with during the campaign. But most of the issues during the transition never come up in a debate. They're never talked about in a press conference. These are the minutia of government. So many issues, so much staff, so many appointments have to be made on issues that never rise to the point of ideology. They're just the normal process of running the government. And much of Washington operates like you know that as well as I do, that most of the federal government is non-ideological, is not actually connected to the kind of most pressing policy agenda of the day, but is quite bipartisan and widely, the consensus is widely agreed upon. A lot of the transition has to do with that, and the effectiveness of that has less to do with the top 3 issues of the campaign and has more to do with the bottom 75 issues that never get a point of discussion. And so it's such an important point to make. And in that way, you're exactly right that when I use the word effectiveness, what I'm referring to is in its sort of governance sense, not in the sense of winning policy victories for one team or another.
Something I'm curious about, because you made the statement just now that typically transitions aren't seen as these partisan things, but I think very clearly, given what happened in 2020, transitions are incredibly partisan, especially if Donald Trump wins in November, because obviously, or wins or loses in November, frankly, just because of the January 6th precedent. So the key thing here is I would love to hear what differentiates the 2000 transition from the 2020 transition. By that, I mean, those are 2 situations where you don't wake up the day after the election knowing who the president is, or at least in the case of 2000, we literally didn't know because Florida was still being counted and it took until December for the Supreme Court to resolve that issue. But at a core level, you just didn't, both sides agreed, we don't know who the president is. In November 2020, one side after mid-November, the Biden administration, Biden team, and the vast majority of the country thought that Biden had won the election, but the Trump internal team did not think they had won the election. So that kind of went on until everything culminated disastrously in January 6th. So I guess what I'd like to hear from you then is at a mentality level, from a norms perspective, from a how do you govern effectively level, how should we understand why the 2000 election, quote unquote, worked in a way that the 2020 election didn't work? From a transition perspective.
Now, in 2000, what we have is the outgoing Clinton administration, the incoming George W. Bush administration. And you're exactly right. That was an election where there was a guaranteed transition. That only happens some of the time. When we have a president running for re-election, we have a possibility of a transition, but that's just a possibility. That's why we hold elections. In 2000, we have, in some ways, the institutions of the transition somewhat more limited. We've always had a somewhat laissez-faire approach to the transition process. It was considered in some ways a private enterprise, operated by a team that was not yet in government, operated by often a nonprofit organization that was doing fundraising. That was happening in 2000. In fact, George W. Bush was preparing for his transition, even though he didn't know whether it was going to happen, as early as 1999. And so one of the things that I think the points in the book is that we focus on the transition happening from the election to the inauguration, that about 11 weeks. But in actuality, the transition process happens a long time before that. For George W. Bush, it happened in 1999 when he asked one of his good friends, Clay Johnson, to begin to organize Ronald Reagan did the same thing in 1980 when he asked one of his advisors to start to prepare. Everyone understands you can't do everything in that 11 weeks. There's just too much to do. And so the process happens very early, and that happens every single cycle. It's happening right now because the process has been so institutionalized that Congress now demands candidates begin their planning very early, and it demands that the sitting White House, even if it's running for re-election, begins the transition to the new administration. So right now, 6 months before the election, the presidential transition has begun. Donald Trump's team is preparing a presidential transition. Joe Biden's team is preparing a transition, even though the outcome of the election hasn't happened. So one of the biggest differences between 2000 and 2020 is the process has become much more bureaucratic, much more well organized. One of the goals of that is to make sure that the process is not risky. Informal, laissez-faire process of the past was deemed simply too risky. It was too risky to allow this to begin to happen without the federal government incorporated into the process. Today, because Congress has acted in a bipartisan fashion, transition process happens early, and that's to make the country as safe as can be as the same time as the campaign is happening. And so the tradition is to have the transition and the campaign happening quite separately from each other and have different teams operating. And that's really what is happening today. You have a transition process that at this point it becomes incorporated with the federal government. Information is shared with the transition team. At the very same time, the campaigns are in a heated contest with each other. And so I think one of the biggest differences we see over time is this institutionalization of the process. Congress now doesn't accept that this can just be a sort of a fly-by-night process. It has to be as rigorous and organized as can be, and it requires the candidates to do so at the 12-month mark, at the 6-month mark, and especially after the conventions. After the conventions, things really begin. That's when the Trump team will be given office space this year in Washington, where its transition team will begin to operate kind of as a team together, assuming that they're all working in the same location, all because Congress demands it. It's something that is part of compliance with a safe and orderly process. Now, which is not to say that this isn't a partisan process. Clearly, this is. The transition team is trying to make sure that the campaign turns into a government that reflects those campaign promises and the promises that the party that wins, that the candidate wins, believes are the right direction. And so it's really this blending of bureaucracy and partisanship that we see during the transition period that makes it so important.
I think the interesting thing that your comment just kind of revealed there is the biggest difference too then between 2020 and 2000, and I never thought about it this way, is that obviously, and you just said this, but you had a term limited Clinton administration handing over power to George W. Bush. Even if the Florida recount had gone a different way, they would have been handing over power to the Al Gore administration. And, you know, there wasn't exactly a lot of love lost between the Clinton team and the Gore team by that point in 2000. So like this wasn't purely just like hunky dory, everyone's happy with each other. Either way, the difference in 2020, and this is also a difference in 2016, because obviously something a lot of people cited was obviously the Obama administration did not want Donald Trump to win the presidency in 2016, and that was quite a big surprise. But at a key level, they were already going to have to transition power over to Team Clinton no matter what. So at a structural level, there was going to be a transition. There wasn't any debate about that. It seems like the vulnerability in our system that's been revealed by 2020 is what happens. And this is also true in 2008. George W. Bush is term limited. He's leaving no matter what. Therefore, it's not a real partisan question of like, do we support this transition or not? 2020 has revealed that there are incentives within this process. I think incentives that, frankly, either side could. I'm not just trying to both sides see things. I'm not trying to like do this annoying both sides see thing, because I think there was something very specific about the people who were running things with Trump's 2020 campaign and administration. I think were bad faith in a way that would have been true if, like, let's say Hillary had lost in 2020. But structurally, there's a vulnerability. How do we understand the dangers of a administration that loses re-election, has a variety of narratives they could use to contest that loss, but also is tasked at a structural level transitioning to the next administration? How should we think of that example and lessons we can learn from 2020 that could move forward to like adjust? Because once again, if Joe Biden loses re-election, we will be in a similar dynamic to what we were in 2020.
Absolutely. And the way I try to get to your question here is by talking to people. And that's really hard during the transition process, because even finding out who's involved in the transition is really difficult. These names aren't always made public. What we know is about half of the names of the people who were involved during the 2020 transition. And that's probably more than we knew in any previous transition. These are people working for a private organization, not for the government. You can't FOIA documents. There's no way to find out other than talking to people. And I talked to people. I talked to lots of people who were involved in the Biden transition. And I asked them a lot of questions, because what we read about in newspapers was about the obstruction from the Trump administration, right? That was the headline. And I wanted to know if that was true. I didn't know if it was true. I sitting at home just like everybody else, but I wanted to know if it was true when they actually encountered the Trump, outgoing Trump administration. Many people I talked to when I asked that question said that the process was actually very normal. They said that the people they encountered with the outgoing Trump administration participated in the transition process, met with people, shared information. The senior bureaucrats were open. Many people I talked to said that the process actually worked the way it was supposed to work. That is a cooperative process. That is the result of an election where one candidate wins and is going to be inaugurated on January 20th. So by and large, the process worked about as well as we would like. Now, it's always the case that these are officials that know that their record is going to be overturned by the incoming administration. That's always going on in the background. But when I talked to people in 2020 for the 2020 transition, they said generally the process worked just about fine.
So what are the headlines then?
But not always. So whereas most people said that, some people said something different. Some people said meetings were hard to schedule. Some people told me that in every meeting there was a political minder in the room that was telling career bureaucrats not to share information. In some meetings, people told me that the outgoing Trump officials said clearly that they didn't think that they were legitimate and weren't going to share information. And the problem, the major national problem, was that those happened to be in two of the most important areas of the government. One is preparation of the budget, and the second was in defense, foreign policy, and intelligence. And so whereas across the board, there was cooperation between the incoming Biden team and the outgoing Trump team, in a couple of the most important areas, cooperation was not the name of the game. So what do you make of that moving forward? I think what you make of that is that the headlines that we read were accurate but not generalizable. It wasn't the case that the entire outgoing Trump team were uncooperative with the incoming Biden administration. That just wasn't true. It's not true that obstruction was the practice across the board. It wasn't true at all. Looking ahead, if you think cooperation is an important principle, and you think that's a principle to keep the country safe and secure, then what you want to do is try to replicate that portion of the 2020 transition and not the portion where there was obstruction. I guess I'm an optimist and think that because most of the people I talked to had fairly typical interactions during that time period, I hope that that's the name of the game in the future, and that some of the small but important areas where obstruction happened would be a thing of the past. And so I think the book sort of tells both stories. Some of what we learned is true, but we didn't talk it to enough people during 2020 to get the full story. And that's what a book allows you to do, is to tell a longer story. I hope a more complete story about a full process that had some good parts and some worrisome bad parts. My hope is that we get more of the good stuff in the future and less of that bad stuff.
I guess what's concerning here, though, is, as you said with the 9/11 example at the start of the episode, the real concern here from a stakes perspective is in the foreign policy, national security, intelligence category. And on the one hand, you could basically point out, as you just did, that like, let's assume like 95% success across transition departments. You know, they've really got the Department of the Interior teams working really well together. The Department of Education is just like crushing it. The labor folks are doing labor things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if the 5% is within that national security category, and it's not the 1990s, it's not even 2000, it's a period where there is a war in Ukraine, where the U.S. is actively trying to tamp down a broader regional conflict in the Middle East. And of course, there's the strong probability of a conflict over Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific. How should we understand then how vulnerable we are given that dynamic? It just seems like the need to get that foreign policy side of this together is just even heightened more than it ever has been. I don't want to say more than it ever has been, but really just in terms of timing, should there be a transition? It seems like this is just like the year to get this right. So what lessons can we take from that going badly, from people not sharing information, from political minders being overly politicized? Like, how should we think about that?
You're exactly right. And I talked to one person who was very involved in one of these meetings that happened in the fall of 2020. And what that person took away was that they hadn't gotten sufficient information to prepare them on day one to be ready should a 9/11 type disaster happen. That was their conclusion. They were not prepared like they should be. And this is somebody who had, knew the ins and outs of government. They knew what they did. They weren't being told, and it worried them a great deal. I think this is an area where Congress has a role to play. Recently, that is over the last decade or so, Congress has come together in a bipartisan fashion routinely to try to address weaknesses in our transition process. They did this just a couple of years ago to make sure that the process of ascertainment is much clearer in the future than it was in 2020. That was a solution that the Congress came together to provide. I think this is a clear case where Congress can play a role, could hold hearings to try to reflect on what happened in 2020 and to try to make sure that it's clear cooperation is the name of the game. Cooperation is a hard thing to legislate, right? It's hard to legislate at that micro level that people play along and do what they should do, right? That's not something you can do with funding. I think it's hard to legislate in many ways, but I think the Congress has a role to play by drawing attention to this issue and drawing attention to something that they have some involvement in, but not total involvement in. Drawing attention to the limited cooperation in some incredibly important areas is something that I think the Senate and House could take up this summer in a bipartisan fashion and show that whatever happened in the past isn't going to happen in the future, and that members of both parties know that whoever wins the election come November, the transition process, whether it's a second transition for Joe Biden or it's a second transition for Donald Trump, cooperation will be the name of the game, especially in those areas of foreign policy. And so I think it's something that Congress has a role to play. I think Congress knows this. They know this because they've dealt with issues related to transitions in the past. And I think that they can take that initiative this summer or even this fall after the conventions and make sure that they promote a spirit of cooperation that George Bush did in 2008 and should be the name of the game in the future.
How confident are you, having spoken to a lot of folks in the space, that a Biden to Trump transition would look like George W. Bush to Obama instead of Trump to Biden? So are you confident this is going to be like 2008 if Biden loses, or do you think it's more like 2020?
As I said before, and I'm an optimist, but you just don't know. We have some early indicators, though. And those early indicators are the ones that Congress has mandated. So Congress, about a decade ago, required that 12 months before the election, the sitting White House, whether or not it's running for re-election, has to begin the transition process. They have to file a report to Congress that indicates that they understand this, and that they're doing it. In 2020, Donald Trump's White House did this, and Joe Biden's White House did this again this past November. And so our earliest indicator, now this isn't a big hurdle to get over, but that earliest indicator suggests the Biden White House understands very well kind of the necessity of nonpartisan and cooperative transition planning. So that was an early indicator, but it was a pretty small hurdle. 6 months before the election, just over the last couple of weeks, they took the next step by, again, following the law, just as Donald Trump's White House did in 2020, to establish several required councils that begin much more earnestly the transition process. Donald Trump's White House did that in 2020. Joe Biden's White House did that just this year. This is a process where key parts of government will get together, assuming that a transition is going to happen, and begin to figure out what is the information that needs to be organized. How is this going to happen should Joe Biden lose? Joe Biden's White House, nearly to the day, followed the law and established these transition councils, including establishing a seat for the Trump transition team. Now, we don't know who's going to fill that seat, but this is a process that is cooperative. Truly, they have people from the major candidates participating in that. So it's hard to know what will happen in the future, but we do know the first two indications are that the Biden White House and Biden-Harris team understand the necessity of this, understand federal law, and are going to comply with it. And so, as an optimist, my strong thought is that the norm of cooperation that's been the norm really for as long as this country has been around, the peaceful transfer of power, has been one of the defining characteristics of our democracy. American exceptionalism is perhaps understood no more importantly than in that facet of our history. That is, we transfer power without question. That's a legacy that future candidates have to uphold. It was shaky in 2020. Some would argue, and I think I argue in the book, that tradition of peaceful transfers of power really came to an end in 2020. It need not continue that way, and I think there are indications that the Biden White House understands this. At the very same time, they're running as hard as they can to win the election.
You know, here's something I'm fascinated by. I've got the book jacket up here, and I want to read a quick quote, which is, "In the end, despite substantial changes in the Democratic coalition, newly influential groups armed with novel tactics, and great shifts in their political agenda, the Biden-Harris transition did not lead to transformation. Roadblocked explains why." I'm just kind of like curious at a theory level here, because one of the big questions that I think has become surprisingly contentious in ways that I don't think the Biden political team anticipated is, what were the American people expecting from a Biden presidency? So you're saying roadblocked, rocky transition. If we're defining rocky transition as like not leading to a presidency that's transformational, I really understand that argument. But kind of what I wonder here is, to what degree was that assessment during the transition that our job is to produce a transformational presidency versus actually our job is to produce just a period of normalcy of 48 years? Was that a political misjudgment? Because I'm increasingly coming to believe that it was easy for us just to kind of say, like, yeah, like Trump's really not normal and Biden's just the normal person. I think a failure to take that political narrative and extend it during this period was a real mistake, especially because, and this is why at the start of the episode, I differentiated between policy success and political success. You see a real failure. And I think these are sort of the Warrenite members of the Biden domestic policy, because kind of like my understanding of what kind of happened here, as someone who talks to a lot of people in these circles, is that you have the Elizabeth Warren types. These aren't Bernie types. These aren't DSA types. These are like people who are left of center left who basically decided, look, Warren didn't get to become vice president in 2016 to fight for those ambitions. She didn't win the presidency in 2020 for the nomination. But you know what? We're going to really own this staffing policy, and we're going to really staff the domestic policy wing of this administration. You see this in Lena Khan world. You see this in the CFPB. You see it in all these different categories. Antitrust, that's very Elizabeth Warren coded. They, I think, were under the impression that the transformational policy ambitions they put forward would actually result in political wins. Everything from the Inflation Reduction Act to the infrastructure spending, CHIPS and Science Act, et cetera. But I don't think that really actually happened. And so then you have this weird situation where you get your policy wins, but there's actually no political win at all. People just don't seem to care. And I think actually this narrative like, hey, America, aren't you exhausted after 4 years of Trump? We're just going to have things be really calm and collected, and we can kind of get our stuff together, would have just been much more as a political win, even if at a policy level, it would have looked weaker. Because I'll stop kind of ranting here, but I'm just obsessed with this because I think so much of the left's understanding of the Obama era was as follows. We had this opportunity after the 2008 financial crisis to be transformational. We were not transformational. And look at all these bad things that happened. You see Occupy Wall Street flame out. You see all of the frustration over the financial crisis in ways that led to Trump. And our failure to not be transformational led to this Trump moment. At the same time, those Obama normalcy years after the midterm election led to a pretty resounding Obama victory. People liked normal, boring Barack Obama. So I'm just curious how you think about this kind of like awkward dynamic here, because I think this transformational versus normalcy debate looks way different in 2024 with Trump leading in most of the swing states right now at this moment than it would have in 2021, where people were saying we are not going to repeat 2009 again.
It's a big question.
Yeah, it's more of a, to be fair, it's more of a statement.
It's more of a statement. No, but it's a statement that I take very seriously and so appreciatively because it really gets to the heart of the book. And to go back to sort of what I did in the book, one of the things that I did is to talk to people who were involved in a couple of the real important moments in 2020. And one of the most important moments for the Biden campaign was when it came together with the Sanders campaign and formed the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force. This was a task force that put together kind of the representatives of the various wings of the Democratic Party and put them in a room, series of rooms on the key issues in the party's agenda and essentially said, let's work this out. Let's work this out so that we have a campaign where we're not fighting over our agenda. And within a couple months, they were able to do this, and they produced reports, and they were basically able to reconcile, in a political sense, what the party was going to be all about. They didn't reconcile the policies necessarily, and many of the people who were involved came out of that and said, we may have reached some consensus. That doesn't mean that, I'm endorsing every element of this. But it was effective politically to organize the party to figure out how to get Elizabeth Warren and all of her representatives on this task force, Senator Bernie Sanders and all of his representatives on the task force, and all of the Biden team as well, to get them around the table to say, here's what we're all going to campaign on. The people I talked to who had participated in that, and then also then during the transition period, talked about sort of how effective that was in making sure the transition process wasn't one where policy debates dominated their work. Because this is a relatively short time period. And so they felt like most of them came out of that Unity Task Force and then the convention with a pretty clear understanding of their marching orders. And so they felt, most of the people I talked to felt like it was pretty clear what they were trying to accomplish during the transition period. The other thing that came out of the conversations that I had was the enormous limitations that come from the transition period. Everyone I talked to talked about how the ceiling on what they could accomplish was pretty low. And that was because the enormity of what they were trying to do was vast. The amount of just the amount of appointments that have to be made, the number of people that have to be interviewed, vetted, put through the confirmation process is just so enormous that not a lot can be accomplished. And so if campaigns are a process of building expectations, the transition process is really one of lowering expectations. That in taking the soaring rhetoric of the campaign and fitting it to a governing agenda, which is much, much more limited. And so everyone I talked to said that their mantra was first 100 days. If this is something that we're going to be able to do in the first 100 days, we can try to do it. But if this is something that goes beyond 100 days, let the administration take care of it. People I talked to talked about this a lot. And this was especially important when they interfaced with all of the groups across DC. You know, this process is an open field day for all of the constituency groups in Washington, all the think tanks, all the interest groups, all the trade associations, all the unions look to this time period as the time where they can cash in on the promises that were made to them. Again and again, people talked about those meetings. They'd bring people together on different topics, and the think tankers and the interest groups and the lobbyists and all the people will come together and make their suggestions. And the message that they consistently said was, you have to be realistic. You have to be limited in your expectations. We can only do just so much. And I think that's something that I really took away from writing the book was, despite the promises of transformation, despite the aspirations for a government that was going to be sort of refashioned in some considerable way, a brand new deal for the American people. In reality, the transition period is a somewhat limited vehicle to accomplish those goals. And that was especially true because much of the transition happened with control of the Senate undecided. Remember, most of the transition happened with an assumption that Republicans were going to maintain control of the Senate, which would mean that the confirmation process was going to be much more difficult than it ended up turning out when the Georgia elections happened that January. And so the working theory during the transition process for Biden and Harris was that this is going to be a very difficult first 100 days because they were going to be facing a Congress that wasn't going to fully adopt their agenda. That changed somewhat in the waning days, but they're sort of as they went through the process, it seemed that they were going to face a Senate that wasn't going to be open to many of their appointees, which had an impact on the people that they chose. I think they probably would have chosen made some different appointments should they have known in November that they had control of the Senate.
What's an example of that? Like who or a position do you think was sort of designed for a Republican Senate versus, okay, we could be a little expansive here?
You know, that's a good question. And I'd have to think about that a little. I'm trying to think of the people that I talked to who mentioned that. You know, one of the reasons why I think that's a great question, but a difficult one to answer is what we're really talking about is not just the cabinet positions. Yeah. You know, we're not just talking about those positions. Those positions clearly matter. But when it gets down to governing, we're really talking about that next layer. We're talking about those assistant secretaries. We're talking about those sub-cabinet appointments, those hundreds and hundreds of positions whose names, unless you're deeply embedded in that issue, you're probably not going to know those names. And so, you know, I guess what makes that a difficult question to answer is I think that probably happened on sub-cabinet appointments whose names, you know, would matter if you're focused on agriculture policy.
Yeah.
But if you're not deeply in the agriculture game, you're probably not going to get the distinctions between the different choices that were made. And so my thinking is that had an impact. People I talked to suggested it did. And I think if you were to try to find it, you'd have to go and really look inside those appointments that were made. And because, you know, the process of making those decisions happens, you know, starts before the election, kind of continues after. We only get those cabinet names during the transition period. After is where we start to get the sub-cabinet appointments. And I think that's really where you'd see the kind of those hard decisions actually made.
So for this last section, I want to pick up where you just kind of left us talking about these interest groups, because I think this is a fascinating thing. So let me just kind of start in no particular order by asking you, I think a problem that you're increasingly having on the Democratic Party side. So as you kind of articulated, and you kind of see this in these interest group transitions, the Democratic Party is less ideological than the Republican Party, in the sense that in many ways, the Democratic Party is a coalition of different interest groups who then align together, and the job of successful Democratic Party chairman or Democratic Party politician, leader of the party, et cetera, is to sort of forge these disparate coalitional groups into a direction which leads to political success. So the Republican Party, by contrast, this is kind of a little more complicated during the Trump era, but historically, during like the Reagan era, we can really say there is this thing called conservatism that we could define pretty straightforwardly. And it's the job then of Republican voters or interest groups, et cetera, to basically say like, hey, like who is like the rightmost person within this broad three-legged stool, within a hawkish foreign policy, within economic libertarianism, and within social conservatism? How do we balance those things together? It's much more straightforward from a coalitional management perspective. But a problem that I've just noticed of late, and I think you kind of see this manifesting in the book, is that if you're going to have a coalition of different groups, and one of your jobs during a transition is inviting representatives of these groups in to advocate for not only appointees, but for policies, for directions, for narratives, transitions versus normalcy, you need to actually be sure that the leaders of those interest groups actually are A, genuinely representative of the communities they're attempting to speak to, but B, I think themselves have accurate understandings of both like the opportunities and limitations thereof. And I just think, especially as you see education polarization come in, especially as you see labor unions weakening, especially as you see this kind of like realignment of like working class, like people of color, not in the sense that they're just like becoming conservative, but in the sense that they're just not like willing to pull the D lever in ways that they were 40 or 50 years ago. I think you have a really serious problem with there being basically self-appointed people who represent themselves as, I speak for Black people or I speak for Hispanic people. And I actually I'm not convinced that they've been able to actually claim that's actually true at an empirical level for a few years. But I think you're especially seeing that in the context of where the Biden administration finds itself and its vulnerabilities in 2024. So how do you think about that side of the table? Well, we'll talk about Republicans in a second, but like, how do you think about like the coalitional representation and the problems and challenges there?
Yeah, it's a terrific question and very much cuts to the heart of the book. There have been a lot of books on transitions that are focused just on the transition process. What I try to do is to open this up and look at the coalitional politics that matter so very much. When the Biden-Harris transition team got together, they said they had four principles that were going to guide their work. Addressing the pandemic was one. Economic recovery was another. Climate change was a third, dealing with climate change, and the fourth was kind of related to, ultimately had to do with President-elect Biden's statement that he wanted a transition team and a government that looked like the American people, and so it got to sort of the diversity of the people that were going to be around him. And when I talked to people on the transition team, they all said they thought about those four things all the time. It was reinforced mantras that was communicated regularly as these are our guiding principles. So if you try to figure out, who you're going to vet for an important position in government, what is the policy agenda of the new administration going to be on some issue, think about those four things. Most people said the four things worked kind of in tandem, that they were not conflictual. They when you made a decision, it was pretty easy to say they fulfilled all four of those principles, but not always. And I talked to some people who would say that the focus of the transition, one of the things they cared a lot about was to try to limit certain industries from having too much influence over appointments. And so people who are going to be coming from Wall Street or representing the oil and gas industry, were pretty clearly stated as not welcomed on the transition team or as appointees in government. talked to other people who said that that made it very difficult for them to find a truly diverse government. They said that they would have candidates that they wanted to put forward to be considered for positions, and those candidates would be thrown out of the pile because they had worked for some time period as a lobbyist for one organization or another, or they had gone to work in Wall Street for some period of time. And they said that they had candidates, Black candidates, Hispanic candidates, that would have been terrific in government, but they were eliminated because the party had made this promise not to appoint people who had some background in an industry. And so I think this gets to your part of your question about the competing priorities within the Democratic Party that most of the time work in harmony. They don't ultimately make it hard to govern. But during the transition period, they tend to crash into each other. And you have potential appointees who are eliminated from the game because they don't meet an ideological litmus test. I talked to other people who said that as the process went out, and again, this is a very sort of private and secretive process, and they said if somebody's name came forward and they didn't pass one of those tests, they would try to figure out how they could coordinate information to get those people knocked out of the game. So let's say somebody had some past working experience that was not going to fulfill some of the priorities or principles of the transition team, they would sort of collaborate on trying to figure out how to get them knocked out of the game. So this happened a fair amount during the 2020 transition. It happened within the transition teams. However much the Biden-Harris leadership tried to promote unity, tried to promote kind of a cohesive process, there's a lot of people. We're talking over 1,000 people involved. And those people come with their own agendas. They come with their own backgrounds. They come with aspirations after the transition end that may or may not align with the incoming administration. Remember, about half of the people on the transition team ultimately go into the government. Mm-hmm. The other half go back to working for their organizations, go back to their regular life. And for those people, they don't have to ultimately execute the administration's promises like they did during the transition period. And so they end up having some conflicts, some of the conflicts that you described. And so we see this on lots of issues where the promises that were made ultimately conflict with other promises. During the campaign, those could be reconciled because it's kind of all talk. Once it gets to actually making appointments, the real hard decisions of governing, that's where you see these things starting to be much more difficult to execute on. And the coalition that the Biden-Harris team was able to kind of stitch together during the campaign starts to fray a bit when the real the decisions that have lasting impact, such as who's going to be appointed to key positions, have to be made. You have to choose one person. You don't get to choose three people. You have to choose just a single person, and that person is going to have all the strengths or weaknesses that any individual person is going to have. And so I think that you see a lot of that, and the people I talked a lot about those kinds of coalitional conflicts that you just described.
So last question. That was the challenge on the Democratic side. It seems the challenge on the Republican side, ever since the Heritage Foundation played a huge role in setting the agenda for the Reagan presidency during the 1980s, you've seen outside Republican conservative interest groups really work to set the transition agenda following that model. However, I think an error that has happened, and I think if President Trump loses in November, this I think will play a not insignificant role, is kind of jumping the gun a little too early on that process and making it too specific. I'm talking, of course, about Project 2025, which is basically a very aggressive, here is a transition, here's us getting the staff together, here are the broad principles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not to say that Project 2025 isn't incredibly organized. It is incredibly organized. This is designed partially to make sure you don't have the chaotic transition of 2016 where you get Mike Flynn doing Mike Flynn-y stuff and then Chris Christie's getting fired. It's very, very effective. I suspect it will be effective relative to what you're talking about here. At the same time, though, I think Project 2025 is totally out of sync with, I think, the broader Trump political narrative, which is basically, hey, guys, remember 2019? Everything was pretty cool. Let's have it be that again. Instead, Project 2025 is, hey, like, here's this far right social policy. Here's this sort of like out of sync, very much not President Trump signing on everything. So there's this need to sort of balance your, you know, under the table political ambitions with just the campaign that Donald Trump is trying to run right now, not trying to talk about abortion, not trying to hit those vulnerabilities. So kind of talk about how the legacy of Heritage in 1980 is both like a useful model for conservatives to think about, but also like a political vulnerability. Because I just see so many Democrats talking about Project 2025 as a real threat. Hey, if you think that Trump and Biden are the same, this is going back to 2019, look at 2025. That's really scary. I think that's a real serious argument, and it gets to sort of the problem of kind of making this transition process and all these interest groups a little too explicit relative to the actual electorate.
Yeah, 1980 is so very important, and I've thought a lot about what happened that year. And remember, though Heritage gets all the notoriety, they didn't get all the appointments. So in 1980, they weren't the only think tank in the game, and in fact, Hoover and AEI both got more appointments in the Reagan administration than Heritage did. Heritage was the loudest. They got the most attention, and have certainly, you know, ever since been the one that people pin to. But they didn't actually win all of the, if the appointment games matter, and we all know in 1980, as after, personnel is policy, according to Ronald Reagan and many others after him. If you think personnel matters, in 1980, Heritage didn't even win that game. They actually had to accept that other backers of Ronald Reagan, other conservative organizations like Hoover and like AEI, got as many spots in the government as they did. And so I think that's important to think about the limitations of any one organization. However well organized, however many other organizations that have joined in coalition with it, there's still limitations on how much any one project can expect to get out of a transition period. And I think there are other projects going on that aren't exactly in full step with Project 2025 that would expect to get as many appointments and as many sort of policy victories. And I think that's just something to keep in mind, that Project 2025 is the most maybe well organized at this point, and is definitely getting the most attention. It's getting the most attention because it's been the loudest itself, but it's also gotten the loudest response from its opponents. Exactly how you suggest. I'm a little bit more skeptical, I think, as you suggest, about this sort of far-reaching ambitions of something like Project 2025 to totally reconstruct the government. I think that's part of what I learned from 2020, is that the greatest ambitions of progressive advocates for what a Biden-Harris administration were going to be ultimately get frustrated by the reality of governing. And I think something very similar would happen should Donald Trump win in 2024. I think the reality of governing, I think the reality of a coalition of supporters that ends up being much more diverse than Project 2025 can capture, would actually be a part of the transition process and would get as many appointments in a second Trump administration as people who are coalesced around Project 2025. And one of the reasons for that is this process usually happens in a quite private and discreet way. It's the way candidates prefer it. It's definitely the way the campaign team prefers it. They don't like the transition crowding out their efforts. And this is in part because the campaign feels like it's going to take away from their electoral possibilities. And I think this is one of the reasons why this past fall, the Trump campaign spoke out quite vocally against not the details of Project 2025, but the way in which they were going about it. And they were simply being too public. I think that was what I took away from the Trump campaign sort of criticizing Project 2025. It wasn't what they were calling for, but it was that they were calling for it so publicly. I think on a real practical level, the other side of this is what goes on with this process of pulling names together. One of the big components of Project 2025 is creating this a database of fully vetted potential appointees, people who would serve across government. And the claims have been made that is going to be thousands and thousands of people who have been vetted and prepared. People I talked to in 2020 who were also doing vetting, most of them said, this isn't something you could have started long in the past. That
Interesting.
Is very time consuming. It takes a lot of people to do vetting, and it's very hard to do vetting secretively. It's very hard to do vetting secretively because ultimately you have to pick up the phone and call people. And if you start calling about some person who's in a database system, that person's going to start taking credit for it. And they're going to talk about the fact that they're being considered for some position in a future administration. Nobody wants that. Candidate doesn't want that. The campaign doesn't want that. Even the transition team doesn't want that. It makes the process of figuring out who's going to be in your potential administration very difficult because it has to be both very vigorous. You have to fully vet people. You don't want people who have secrets in their past that come out later and are going to embarrass administration, while at the same time trying to do it very secretively. And those two things in some ways are incompatible. In 2020, when I talked to people, simply being invited to work on the Biden-Harris transition team was something that was kept secret. People I talked to said that they were sworn to secrecy. They couldn't even tell family members that they were working on the pre-election transition team because of the deep fear of word getting out. And so everyone basically kept it a secret. They didn't even tell their roommates, their family members, what they were up to. I think something similar will happen on the transition planning for Donald Trump. And I think the effect of that is to make the work of outside groups less effective than they would like. And so, again, this idea of effectiveness. If part of what these outside groups are demonstrating that they are influential, part of the press conferences and reports and all of that work that goes on is to show that. It doesn't exactly correlate with influence with the incoming administration, because organizations, whether it's the Center for American Progress or the Heritage Foundation, all need to do two things. They need to show that they're influential, but they also want to actually seek influence. And those two things aren't always the same things. And so the competing interests between the groups and the campaigns really play out during the transition period. And it's one of the reasons why I think, despite the organization that Heritage Foundation has put into place, I think there's a real ceiling on what they could accomplish prior to the election and even after the election should Donald Trump win. I think it's still a very cumbersome, bureaucratic process that tends to lead to more of the status quo being maintained than the radical transformational aspirations of the people who wrote those chapters for the Mandate for Leadership, or the people who wrote the reports that were sent to the Biden-Harris team that called for full transformation of the federal government. This ultimately is a much more cumbersome process than anyone would like. I think that cumbersome process probably leads to the country being more safe and secure, and is the way Congress would like it. I think a process that is much more freewheeling also would probably be less safe and secure for the country.
That is an excellent place to leave us. Heath, thank you for joining me on the show. The book is Roadblocked, Joe Biden's Rocky Transition to the Presidency. It will be released in coming weeks, so folks should definitely pay attention to that. I really think that this is just such a relevant topic right now, and I know folks who are on these various teams will be engaging with this work moving into November and December. So thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Yeah, Marshall, there's a lot of podcasts. Nobody hosts one with the amount of interest and detail, and you take your guests so seriously that it's been such a pleasure to come on. I've listened to so many of the previous episodes, and you just are a model of what every guest would like in a host. And so thank you. You provide an enormous service.
Thanks for gassing me up. Appreciate that.